In the case of the Antwerp Orthodox Jewish community, Dr. Longman and Chia said that the secular education was taken for granted as a given, and because the education was taken for granted, then the religious education could be actually totally, thoroughly traditional. I mean, that's what I thought you were getting at. And in Sarah's paper, secularism was positioned as a given, and as a negative given that had to be shut down. Now, could we maybe take off from there? Because as somebody who sees secularism as an ongoing battle that we have not won at all, and that we've been trying to fight since the 18th century, I've been taken aback that you see this as a given and as an accomplishment, not you particularly, but the people that you're working with. So could we take it from there? For me, an unfinished historical process that I would want to back, and obviously, clearly, but certainly ongoing. And for yourself and the people that you're working with, something that is there, accomplished, a negative, of course, and that we have to work around. Could we take it from there? And I think it's Chia's turn, I think, to have your voice heard.
I'm not quite sure what part you referred to in my paper. I think I said that the women I interviewed took gender equality in the secular realms for granted. So that was more the point I was trying to make there. Secularism as for granted. I'm not sure conceptually or...
I think you have promoting their own roads towards the secular outside world. I think I noticed it too, what Rosie said. So they were talking about how they would position themselves, I think, towards the outside secular world. I think that's what you were mentioning. So.
That's what I remember as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure where to pick up on. I'm not sure what question.
The question would be whether that really in the vision of secularism, whether how you stand in relation to that, whether in fact you see it as, yes, it is so. I mean, you know, the Antwerp Belgian society is secular and there's certain premises.
Well, no, I mean I keep it quite open here. My papers theoretically. Here I've tried to, like raise some questions, and I don't know. I'm trying to look for some challenges, I suppose, towards secularism and a particular, feminist understanding of that. I haven't gone into it theoretically in the sense that Sarah does, talking of different subjectivities and so forth. But no, I think the underline is I'm trying to question it somehow, in the sense that these women are also questioning it. In a sense, I'm not sure.
May I just perhaps say something which lines up with your paper, because what I noticed is that those women are speaking of an increasing secularization. So that the process is really not ending already, has not ended already, but it's getting more and more difficult to live their lives according to their own laws and rules and their own identity as religious people. So in that sense, it's really an ongoing battle, and so that things are getting more and more
secular.
Yeah,
and especially, and it's very much gendered. Yeah, it's very much gendered. Their difficulty is with the way what gender equality, about the sense, for instance. And also they're especially they're for gender equivalence, yeah. So women and men, in equal work and so on. But they're very much critical of the sexualization of society and so on. Where, for instance, in the 50s or so, they didn't see it as so different. Like interviews were saying, and that's one of the reasons why they're becoming increasingly isolationist and so on, is because. For instance, in the 50s, women also wore skirts and so on. Lots of these women, some of the women I spoke to, even from the stricter community, they also went to schools, the general schools. But now they see it increasingly problematic, to send their children and their daughters there. But that's in terms of gender and sexuality and so on. Increasingly secular. For schools there, what I can say for schools and education, now what's interesting maybe to point out, also in terms of gender roles, is that I mentioned Dina, so one of the women there that has the role of the bridge builder, as a bridge builder between Orthodox schools and the state, is that lots of the girls' schools are still subsidised by the government, because the girls, also somewhat paradoxically, are more exposed to the secular world because they don't go off to yeshiva or do Talmud studies, which the boys do, yeah? So they get profane subjects, and those schools are still subsidised by the state, whereas the boys' schools are private, yeah? So that's also somewhat of a paradox, maybe. But they're coming into problems, these schools. And what's also interesting is that she saw it as and this brings us to the debate on multiculturalism and the relationship between, rethinking of the relationship between church and state, religion and state, and so on. Is that the pressure is coming because of the pressure on Muslims. I know that here in the Netherlands, of course, you do have Islamic schools, I think. Whereas in Belgium, they're only just starting, or it's a whole debate for them to be subsidized. The state doesn't want that, whereas the Jewish schools have been there for ages, yeah. But because of the pressure on Muslim communities and the whole debate there, the pressure is also increasing, according to this woman, on the Jewish schools, and hence we can check up, yeah, on whether they're getting enough sexual education and so on. Yes, but conceptually, I mean, I'll have to think about that more. I think, the term secularism, but indeed, of course, it's something dynamic or going, something that's being redefined, and sure, yeah.
Is it on this point taking only interventions on this particular
discussion? You said in your paper that there are two reasons, or you mentioned two reasons for the parents not let the girls go to secular schools. One was drugs, and the other one?
AIDS. That was one of my interviewees who made that comment. Yeah. And she went to university in Brussels in the 60s, so I was like, what was it? Yeah. But anyway, that was her perception. Yeah. So of the difficulty.
And I wonder if it's a kind of characterization of what secularism is, that they are trying to identify secularism as some sort of religion or religion-like movement which is going in a really bad way, and trying to put some bracelets on secularism, saying this is secularism, like drugs are secularism, or liberalism drugs, and AIDS is secularism. And maybe when, I can't say in a Jewish context apocalypse, but when the revelation shall come, these people who are some sort of infidels will go to wherever they would belong. Or at least they are constructing some kind of secular set of characteristics which are easy to identify. That's what I can see in some way, by giving some definitions, easy definitions like drugs, HIV, whatever.
Yeah. I'm trying to get to the discussion now. No, I wouldn't say just like we're the religious versus the secular, but also other factors and identity markers, of course, is this community as ethnically, yeah, in the first as a Jewish community. So talking of the outside world is not just talking of the non-religious or the secular world or whatever, but as a minority, an ethnic minority community, within a broader Gentile also, a non-Jewish Gentile world, a secular world, so in that sense. Maybe another small comment on thinking of being religious versus secular, and also my impression was trying to compare the two papers and the points of comparison. There were definitely points of overlap and comparison in the discourse, but also the way in which your paper was much more almost like theological discourse and everything there. The theological discourse which I missed in my interviews. I think one factor for that being that these, I'm not sure about the members of this movement, whether they, they were born into it, brought up in it, or that they were people that actively chose, which is a difference. Whereas my interviews are people who are like born, raised as Orthodox Jews, so this like reflective aspect on theological discourse, also in terms of gender roles, is much more absent. And there is an emphasis on more on ritual, on practice. What do you do? What do you have to do to be an Orthodox Jew? What do you have to do? And much less reflection in that sense, on religion as a term, or what does it mean to be religious, or to be religious is what you have to do. You have to follow the laws in the halacha, and much less emphasis on faith and so on. So this, this is a way of, reflecting on in any sense, what does religious mean versus secular, and how the ethnic and so on is related to that.
Yeah, I followed this ethnic issue, which is quite important.
Yeah.
Yes, it goes back to the same issue, because I was struck how the interviews from Antwerp, they were more on this outside and inside framework. So we are inside the community and then outside.
Yeah,
and
very much.
pointed to the issue also of the ethnic minority, so it's not just. And also, so the women, they refer more back to this solidarity within the community. Instead, in the Comunidad de Liberación, you can see that it's a movement which is, okay, I don't know how much, but it has a big role inside Catholicism, and it's a movement composed by Italian white, let's say middle class, within a generally Catholic society. So I think, how do you frame this issue of the ethnic minority and majority, and also, but I think it's interesting also to see what is the position of the group, then of the within the general society, because then in Comunidad de Liberación it can become more individualized, because the majority is more like me, so I can also I'm different, but at the same time I'm not pointed as different in a way. And also I would like to ask if you interview any Jewish woman who's not from the Orthodox, if there's also a Jewish community that is not Orthodox, because I don't know how much the Jewish community is Orthodox or not, but what is the relation then only about Jewishness and not about being the Orthodox community?
Several questions. Well, Antwerp is quite exceptional in that sense. It's also sometimes called as a shtetl, like in Eastern Europe, or the Jerusalem of the North, that kind of. Because it's relatively small. It's about between 20 and 25,000 Jews, but most of them are at least nominally Orthodox. So in that sense, it's quite unique. And then I also mentioned there's the influence of especially, and then the Haredi, or the very strict, so fundamentalist, ultra, whatever you want to label them. Jews are about a quarter, or a bit more of that population, and then they have quite whole, I think, institutionally, and it's also, in terms of social control, and the sense I got from the interviews over the rest of the community. And I focused, there's a whole diversity, of course, I tried to, just very briefly, among Orthodox is a whole label ranging from, very ultra to modern, and then you can problematize the labels and so on. And so within there's a great diversity within the Antwerp community, but also worldwide. So no, I haven't, interviewed any. It would be a whole other research project whether liberal or even that's just among religious Jews. Yeah, I'm not even talking about secular Jews. So, so no, I haven't talked to. But I know the debates and especially the debates on women's status there. I have in London, or within the Orthodox community, talked to more modern Orthodox feminist women. So you also, and especially in the States and in Israel, you definitely do have a movement, and that wasn't the focus of this paper, but within the religious sphere, where women are sort of struggling for equal rights within the religion and within the ritual and more the realm itself. but I didn't find any of that in Antwerp, any women who explicitly sort of, just a few, or any, let alone any forms of activism there. So it's quite conservative, quite orthodox community there. Yeah, so that answers your question. But I don't know, function of what? Of what you were...
because I was thinking of this issue of the minority, of the, as you say, ethnicity and ethnic minorities. I was thinking...
Yeah.
The religion is something, but there's also this...
Yeah, but of course, I mean, in Belgium itself, it's not the biggest Jewish communities in Brussels, where most Jews then again are either secular or liberal or reform, but not orthodox. So yeah. Now on the first question, that was more towards Sarah, I think.
No, it was both.
Yeah.
How do you articulate the majority minority in your research?
Okay.
Because Sarah, she made a comparative, so I in the different situation, but also you, how do you see this?
No, maybe just a quick another thing is that Orthodox Jews themselves will see fellow secular Jews as not real Jews. Yeah. So that's how the insider's definition of so that's and then that's a different definition. Yeah, that's not the not real Jews. Yeah, Jewish born, but yeah. And we'll also see all women becoming rabbis. Oh no, that doesn't exist in Orthodox Judaism. Maybe in America or the liberals do that, but we don't do that. Although there are, I know there are internationally now, but yeah.
Quickly, and then Sarah gets right reply.
And I just wanted to add that in Orthodox Jewish religion or whatever it is, there is no notion of returning back. So if you ever break the rules of being Orthodox, if you become secular Jew, you are no longer considered to be a person. So for the Orthodox people. For the
but it's very much there isn't something like excommunication
there
in that
no
sense. It's not in the sense of
the notion of the religion doesn't include excommunication.
No.
It's based on the idea that you have to pray until the prophet or the Messiah comes. And if less people are praying, that's a problem. But we have to pray on. There is no. We are not, or Jewish people are not saying that you are excommunicated, you are infidel. They simply no longer pay attention and bring them into another box, the secular box.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Point taken on this clip. Sarah, you have a whole list of questions. Choose which ones you address and then we return with you.
I'll start with the thing about secularism and position as a given. It's true that I don't develop that in the paper, although because I did this for my previous work, for the doctoral dissertation, because I did this comparative, or not really comparative, but I studied religious movement in different contexts, I have been thinking in terms of some comparative perspective on secularism or secular contracts. I guess the notion that I have mentioned in the paper is an idea of there's a secular contract in a society, right? So that is, let's say, a more institutionalized notion. Of course, that doesn't mean that there's minority secularisms being discussed or possible, but there is a moment of a societal contract in which the position of religion is established through law, position of church-state is established through law, and for instance, in the Catholic case, it's the so-called concordat, right? So, and in that sense, in Italy, I think Italy has, all the European countries really have, let's say, a particular position, right? The secular contracts are all really specific. The Italian secular contract is specific in the sense that, in contrast to some other states, like for instance the Netherlands or actually also Belgium, the state has been created, the Italian state has been created against the Italian church, whereas for instance the Dutch state formation has been with a backup of Dutch Protestantism, so, and then the pillarized model, and Belgium also a pillarized model, but in a different way. So, but I think in the Italian case, the Italian state is created against the church, and hence the great antagonism between the Italian state and the Italian church, and then the need to find, you know, the coordinates of this concordat. And
but when I annotate that, I don't know if people understand that the Catholic Church is a state. The Vatican state is a nation state in the heart of Italy. And consequently, it was important to have a legal treaty between the Vatican state, which in the olden day occupied half of Italy, stretching all the way up to Bologna. The University of Bologna is the oldest in Europe because it was created by the papacy, the papal state back in the 15th century. Pisa, Galileo is another one. They forgave Galileo, they corrected a mistake in Galileo last year. It took them 400 years, but they got there. So we're talking about a nation state inside another nation state.
Not a nation state. I think the state solution in Concordat.
The Vatican state.
Yeah, but the state solution kind of emerged in a context of emerging nation states, basically. So the Vatican is this strange little state. You cannot call it a nation state. It obviously does not have the institutions of all the other nation states in Western Europe. It's the format of a state pushed on an institution that did not function as a state. The Catholic Church was not a state nor a nation state. So, and what makes the Italian case, for instance, different from the French case, where you can also say the French state, okay, French nation-state building happened against the Catholic Church. So I think Italy and France are the two examples in Western Europe where the nation-state established itself against the Catholic Church. In all the other countries, it's all more complicated and different ways of collaborating and not collaborating. But in the French case, the state won the legitimacy also, so not only institutionally it won, it also won the legitimacy. And in the Italian case, the Italian state did not win the same kind of legitimacy. Why is it that some of these like militant Catholic movements come out of Italy, apart from the fact of the closeness of the Vatican, which is one factor, but I don't think probably it's not maybe even the most important factor. It's because there is this militancy and antagonism that is already part of how the field is structured between religion and state. And it's not a coincidence that Giussani finds, wants to learn from Marxism, wants to learn from Gramsci, is using the term antagonism. Like, it doesn't come from him. It's part of, in one sense, how the field is structured. But they take it up with incredible, and then what we were talking earlier, not only do they take up that game of antagonism, and indeed in that sense, the secular becomes positioned as, in the same way that for some of, or for much of maybe the left wing and the Marxist groups, the religious church gets positioned, you know, like that kind of very antagonist position, but with the added discipline of a religious movement, which means that they actually, in those, what is it now, in 50 years, have managed from, because the first GL groups were literally, it was women, and it was Don Giussani and like 3 or 4 women, and for years, and then it became like 10 and then 20. So literally in 50 years, they did the thing of what Jesus did, right? No, I mean, they did the thing of starting with a small group and becoming an imperium in Italy, that's true. And taking secularism as the outside world question, because of this antagonist framework in which they put themselves and see their relationship to the Italian state, and especially, I mean, the antagonism was stronger many years ago, right? Like by now, they are parts of, they are not the state, but they have infiltrated many parts of the Italian state. But when the antagonism was really strong, this notion of we being different and the outside world, even though these are indeed middle-class, white Italians, there's no ethnic difference, there's no... That came from this notion of... I'm not sure if I know where it comes from, but I know what the markers were. Like one of the markers, for instance, interestingly, and that's why I didn't manage in the beginning with my research asking about gender and sexual difference, one of the markers was exactly sexual difference. And it played up till when I was in the movement, right? I mean, when I was doing my fieldwork, like there were moments when I was also living, it was a very intense fieldwork, so I was living together with one of these women's houses, and there would be moments of like putting on the television and, okay, right television, having some, I don't know, game or whatever program in which the women who are presenting it are all basically half naked dancing around, and you know, like typical images in which, like, seriously they would say, like, okay, you as a foreigner now, okay, sit down now, look, do you find that normal? Do you find that normal, what is going on in the outside world? You know that in Italy this is, and everybody finds it normal, people just laugh with it. Do you find that normal? We don't find that normal. So it's through references like that, and there's a whole list of them, and I'm going to tell all of them, there was this construction of we as different from this outside world. So when people manage to tell me things like, you know, sexual harassment and discrimination, that is something of the outside world, it's not us. This has a history of many years and decennia of constructing all these little markers of how we are different from the outside world, right? Like, of course, in the 50s, Giussani didn't start by saying this. So this has a history of building up a cultural difference, in a sense. And it was perceived as a cultural difference, but the culture was secular culture versus Catholic culture. And so there was an attempt to create Catholic culture, because like the movement by now also has its own publishing houses, and they put CDs on the markets and books on the market. And if you look at the selection of what is being part of, you know, what kind of literature is being republished through their publishing house, or what kind of music is being put out there, it is a creation of a separate culture. And that's where the aesthetics as well comes in, right? So it's and also thinkers. It's amazing. Like, I'm still amazed by Giussani's selection of thinkers. For instance, Hannah Arendt is all over the place. Hannah Arendt is a big favorite, so she gets republished and translated, and it's like a very conscious bricolage, almost selection of what are we going to create as our culture, and then look at this mass culture around you. Like, isn't it horrible? And this is not us. So that's how the outside-inside thing works in a position of a majority, basically, because it's true, there's no ethnic minority or other kind of minority there.
Can I just pursue this before we go to the next point? It's inside, outside of what? It's inside, outside. The dividing line there is a morally driven, a religiously sustained community of virtue. That's the inside, and the outside is an immoral, sinful world.
Yeah.
The second.
Yeah,
That's
exactly the same.
So, but this distinction was already made in the 12th, 13th century by people that lived in convents and monasteries. So I repeat my question of what is the novelty of this. And your answer has been sociological, that a lot more people are talking like this. But we're not talking about conceptual categories that are staggeringly new. This is like the virtuous inside, the sinful outside. We've been there before.
Yeah, no, but I don't think that is novel at all. I think inside-outside distinction is not novel. When I talked about what I think is novel is and novel not in relation to whatever the Middle Ages or whatever, but in a modern time period, is actually this challenging of the secular contract. Like there's
the creation of alternative communities.
For instance, or alternative culture. But you know, there's many religious movements who in fact do not challenge. So I don't take religion as challenging the secular contract, because a secular contract is not about abolishing religion, it's about organizing religion. So you decide what are appropriate places for religious expressions and for which religious expressions, and you decide which ones are not appropriate. That is a secular contract, and it looks very different in all West European countries, which is why we have the headscarf debates in France as we have them in France and not in other places. So that is a secular contract, and the challenging of the contract itself with a certain assertiveness in a modern period is a new thing by virtue because of being in a modern period and having to do with religious political actors. That kind of actor is a new thing. I mean, I'm not celebrating the new. I mean, it's like a sociological analysis of pointing to this, and because previous religious movements, you know, there have been many religious movements from the beginning of the century, like whatever, we have Opus Dei. Opus Dei, who functioned for the longest time, now it is challenging the secular contract, but it functioned for the longest time through not challenging the secular contract openly, because that was exactly Opus Dei. Like, So Opus Dei was founded, when was it? In the 20s, I guess. So the estimation in the 20s was that it was difficult to do that in such kind of open way as religious movements are doing at this moment in time. So it had to go underground. You had to be like a lodge, like an underground force. That was the estimation at the time. Estimation at this time, apparently, for many of these religious movements, is that you can go in the political arena and do a kind of religious politics, which now I'm talking about that part of the story, but I don't want to reduce it to it's only politics. The politics come out of this construction of an alternative culture, faith, community, however you call it, in which people esteem that it's important to also be in the political sphere and to also do politics, precisely in order to make the construction of that way of being in the world possible, because they think, they esteem that within a secular contract, their way of being in the world is being threatened, or is not allowed, or is, you know, think of the headscarf debate, like it's a way of being in the world that is does not get its place in a secular society. So that's, I'm talking from their perspective, that's the stake of doing politics. Because sometimes, like, okay, now I'm thinking of debates of political Islam, when people kind of flatten it out and say, you know, like it's not really about Islam, this is just, you know, opportunistic politics. It's not just deny that there is opportunistic politics, but there's opportunistic politics everywhere. But it runs much deeper than that. It's not just, this is a new position we can take in the political field, nobody has taken this yet, let's do Islamic politics. It comes from movements and organizations around the way of being in the world that at some point decide, like, okay, at this point we actually need to be in the public sphere and fight for this way of being in the world because it's being foreclosed. So that is a novel moment. That is, so I
think you just provided the definition of postsecular there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if I should say more about that. It's as you know, as Chia was speaking, I was thinking about how this works with Chia, this inside out world. I had just noted down some notes, right? So the RAI worked like that. Also Kant, for instance. I had a number of students say, like, going to secular education, and you know, we just were taught Kant as if he's the truth. But luckily, you know, like I was able to counter-argue. So there's that kind of idea of, I don't know why I just wrote down Kant and RAI, and constructing and answering back and responding to dominant culture, which is seen as to exclude certain ways of being in the world, religious ways of being in the world. And the antagonism of Chia is sometimes very tiring because it's, how to say, Chia is militant, right? So there's this these are militants for God in one way, and it is tiring because they are like a majority movement in terms of ethnicity and of, you know, so the more that they are accumulating power, and they are accumulating power, the more that you feel like saying, like, listen, come on, like, get out of that position of being on the losing end of the antagonism, right? Like being the, I wouldn't say victim because, like, the word is not really used, but you know what I mean, right? Like being the one who is, like, who is on the losing power end of the antagonism. So you feel like, come on, it doesn't reflect Italian society at this moment in time. Their alliance with, you know, with Forza Italia, and then of course they go, you know, because I also had these discussions with them, and then they go.
Can you summarize? I don't want to
okay, so
otherwise you take us into other
points.
A majority movement representing a stream and align themselves to the very sources of the evil. Berlusconi, whose television is something to fight with, and immensely powerful, together with the Opus Dei. So the majority issues, opposed to what sounded more in Dr. Longman's research, minority groups, and again, gender and ethnicity intervening powerfully. I'm looking at you people. Who wants to ask questions? Come back on this, expand, or shift the grounds? Or, yes, please.
Yes, well,
tell us who you are again.
I'm Inge Versteegt. I'm an intercultural psychologist, and I'm basically here because it relates to my thesis subject, which is some time ago about young Orthodox Christian women and Orthodox Muslim women. I compared them, the two groups in the Netherlands. I would like to, I'm sorry if I'm not too clear, because I'm trying to, while I'm speaking, trying to find out what I'm thinking and what other people are thinking.
This is our privileged university people.
Yes.
It's confused as hell, anyway.
The whole concept of modernity and the place of these traditional groups, I think, is also that the fact that there's a choice available is perpetuating the conservatism of these groups. Because if you are brought up in a group and you don't agree with it, you will step out of it. So it increases the conservative power of these groups. I believe that is happening right now within some of these groups. Of course, they all have a certain truth, and if you only have one truth and you get a debate about it, you will have to separate again those who really have the truth from those who were, so they will split up, and I believe right now, if you look at the Orthodox Christians, that some of these groups in the Netherlands are becoming quite, I wouldn't really say radical or violent, but still, if you, for instance, compare a school like the Driestar, which used to be a pretty rather conservative but Protestant Christian school, and you take a picture, you look at the picture there, the women most of them were wearing jeans. Right now, you're not allowed in there with jeans. You have to wear a skirt. So I think the modernity, with its focus on choice and its with its discourse on choice, is creating, in a way, its own antagonists. So I was wondering, how do you feel about this paradox within the secular modern society?
The paradox being that there is an active construction of an opponent that would be against individualism and choice. Is this?
Yes, I think if you would look at the traditional societies that these groups tend to idealize, within those societies there was not really a choice. Whatever was good was already decided for you, and these people can, well, how to say it? They can create their sense of having the truth, and in meanwhile, those who disagree will not change or transform that group. They will step out of it, and so they can be seen as some sort of a parasite on society. They need the modern society and its availability of choice in order to sustain.
It was actually what I meant by the question that secularism is taken as a given, and then yes. So we're going to get the speakers. Open to you again.
Yes, I mean that's exactly. Yes, I would agree with that analysis. Except, from the interviewee's perspective, and that's also what sort of women said. They would say, well, we're doing what we always did, what we did centuries ago. We're not changing. Yeah. And I've also used one of these quotes as a title of an article. Yeah, it's not, we're not changing, you've changed. Yeah? But in order to remain the same, we have to become more isolationist, just to sort of, be able to hang on to, keep our identity and demarcate that, yeah, from the outside, as it's called. So definitely, and that does perpetuate certain conservatism. And it also, has to do with the whole, different historical context in which such groups live. Yeah. Whereas, in 17th, 18th, Eastern Europe, I mean, it was indeed taken for granted and so on, and people just leave this way. But there's a whole new different context. These people are also citizens. They're also so definitely, yeah. And there's a tendency to become conservative, more conservative because of that.
Sarah, you're taking an answer?
So I'm thinking about it now in terms of Talal Assad's notion of tradition and living tradition. Because if we look at it like that, because his notion of a living tradition is okay, it's something which is dynamic, right? So a tradition is something which is ongoing, dynamic, people position themselves in it, they have conflicts, they renew something, so, you know, like Catholicism as a tradition, for instance, or the Catholic Church. And if you look at it from that perspective of a tradition, it's true that perhaps there is less space for people who are totally, who would in one sense still consider themselves in the tradition or are not actually looking to be kicked out, but are saying things that are heretical, right? And in some weird way, you're right, in a modern context there might actually be less space for heresy. I think there is much less space for heresy because there's no need to be heretical, right? Like you leave the tradition. Whereas, you know, the great heretical whatever thinkers and whatever of all the centuries before, of course heretics are crucial. Heretics have reshaped traditions. Heretics have. So there is something about this position of the heretical that in modern society is disappearing because we have all these different traditions beside each other. And I would, for one, and for me that links also to a definition of the post-secular, I think it's also important to look more and more at liberalism as a tradition in exactly the same way as we're looking at religious traditions with the exactly same analytical tools. And so, you know, so you can change tradition. If you don't like it here, you know, go to the liberal tradition. You don't like it there, go to a feminist tradition. You don't like it there, go to a gay and lesbian tradition. Like, you can change, and the thing of remaining in a tradition and being the great heretic and paying with your life for it. I mean, you know, or not necessarily, but like taking on that tormented role of arguing with the tradition, but staying, but arguing, but staying. There's less and less of that.
And doesn't that change the whole definition of oppression? If you can always leave an oppressive tradition. I refer to the discussion that's going on with women not being able to be part of the SGP in the Netherlands, and this woman who's trying to fight for her right to be an active party member is most of the time told to just leave the group. Why don't you just leave?
Which is also a very liberal idea. Why don't you just leave? That is part of a liberal tradition, because in many traditions there's this idea of, but this is going on. I don't
see how you're drawing in classical liberalism in this. Could you explain? I don't see it.
I mean, I'm just proposing, I haven't developed it, like I'm proposing to look, that it would make sense to look at liberalism as a tradition, in the same way that, for instance, Assad uses his notion of living traditions and looks at Islam, Assad looks, or at Christianity as well. But because I think it makes sense, because by now liberalism has a long history, and there's dissenting voices, and there's conflicts, and there's splits, and I think it would actually help us if we could think about secularism and liberalism as a tradition. It might help us to do some kind of a renewal that I consider is necessary. And for instance, of some of these scholars who work with that work of the scholarship of Talal Assad and Zalal Mahmoud, and that new scholarship kind of questioning the liberal secular. There is somebody who works with that. His name is Armando Salvatore. He works with those references, and at the same time also has an agenda of what the others don't have, of renewing the secular tradition. And for instance, Rosie, very obviously, he goes to Spinoza. So, and I think it actually makes sense, that move of, which does mean, and that is the scary part probably for many liberal secular positions, it does mean a kind of, how to say, parochializing of liberalism and secularism, like putting it as a tradition among others, which is not to say cultural relativism, which is not to ignore the fact that there are certain power positions, like liberal secular power positions, so it's not just to even it all out, but what could we gain from looking at liberal secularism in that kind of way? It might actually I think it joins your point
A
of
tradition in the sense, not in the sense of a revealed truth tradition, but a historical tradition, absolutely. Yannis Siani has been bashing our ears about this, and the glorious tradition of European liberalism, and a tradition that builds in critical dissent and really strong individualism. So it's a tradition that can be only compared to the religious ones in the fact that it has a long historical lineage, but in the elements of it are dramatically opposed to anything that would be, you accept the revealed truth, you accept the religion, and then you're in or you're out. Liberalism is the opposite. It's critical dissent, it's individual choice, and only the trappings, some people would say, the protocols of liberal democracies, which are based on dissent and opposition, precisely. And in that sense, the opposite of the religious tradition, unless we go back to some, as you said, the heretics, all of whom were burned at the stakes in one way or the other. So I don't know in what sense.
I'm really talking about specifically Assad's notion of tradition, which is, it's a sociological category, so it's not looking at like whether it's revealed or not, but really, but from that point would disagree with what you just said about in all religious traditions or other traditions, or like to take the nasty examples, right? So from the secular point of view, like the religious traditions and the nationalist traditions, like in all those kind of traditions, you have an incredible amount of dissenting voices, conflicts. There is no one religious tradition in which there is one agreed upon truth and whether you're in or out. I mean, look at what happened within Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, creation of new churches, creation of new movements. They fight each other. Look what happened within Islam, the Shia, the Sunni. It is so unuseful, I find, to solidify religious traditions in this kind of, you know what I mean, like this kind of, there's one revelation, there's one book, and we have, this one.
Okay, authority versus democracy.
There's democracy in religious traditions as well. There's authority in liberal and secular traditions. So this is what I'm saying.
What democracy do we have in religious traditions? That takes care of Catholicism, Islam, a shining example. Classical Judaism, come on. Let's be grounded here. This is nuts. Come on, this is super fun. Let's fight about this, because this is at the heart of the discussion, and this is why liberalism wouldn't count in my terms as a tradition in the same way, because it builds in protocols of absolute systematic orchestrated dissent, opposition, dialogue, a dialogue that is regulated by the rule of law that is upheld by the rule of reason. I'm just playing devil's advocate as a economist, but this is the opposite of it.
It is nonetheless an ideology.
Let's not shift the discussion, but maybe, but I think on the democracy issue versus religious authority, this is crucial.
Yes, I mean there's something different between the official view of those religions and the practical thing. I mean, every Catholic in the Netherlands is perhaps against Pope, so to say. So there's a lot of
notoriously,
yes.
The Dutch catechism. So,
yes. And they're still calling themselves Catholics. So I mean, it's possible within the Catholic Church in the Netherlands to be Catholic and not agree with the Pope. So that's a very small example of something like democracy there.
Agency, perhaps. I think you come back to the agency question there, of course.
Yeah.
And I think in my case study anyway, I mean, that's what I was trying to point out, there's agency, and then there's dissent there as well. It means that some of the women I interviewed were dissenting in some respect. Yeah. And then coming back to what you said, of course, from an outsider's viewpoint, an analytical viewpoint, a liberal viewpoint, maybe even say choice is avoidable when we analyse a case study such as that. But then looking again at the people themselves, the people I interviewed them and how they live, where they come from. I mean, dissent, it's not such an easy thing. Yeah? I mean, imagine you're brought up in such a world, your family and your relatives. To go away, to leave that all behind is not, it's not evident. I just want to bring it back to sort of, the people, and their lives, and trying to understand that, when you're talking to people and
Because you're
getting
not-
into that, and I mean it's a choice. You know, what are sort of the implications of making such a choice? And another, maybe a small thing again, bringing it back to my research, to the empirical research. And again, I think there's also, we haven't gone into that, but I think there's very much differences between the religious traditions in that sense. I already pointed out as saying maybe, there's more the emphasis on theology, theological discourse, faith and things like this, whereas in Orthodox Judaism and Islam maybe there's less of an emphasis on that and there's more practice. And I've also, I've talked to women in Orthodox Jewish women in London, they would say that as some of them as women, they can get away with dissent, more in a sense, as long as they conform externally to sort of, covering the hair and so on, sometimes more than men can, yeah? So in that sense, dissent, yeah, maybe as long as they stick, sometimes also more in terms of social control, sticking to these modesty norms and so on. But then again, that's more the question of agency. But democracy, of course, is
it involves authoritarianism belongs to this discussion. I think if we would just agree that those items have to be kept on the agenda, because otherwise we are sort of slipping into dangerous areas. Thank you.
Perhaps it links with what is going on, but I remain quite intrigued in both your work to look at an intergenerational perspective, because I heard Chia say family is always the first priority, and I hear Sarah say without family the social tissue would fall apart. And if I look at my research in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, it has a strong Catholic tradition. And if I look at, I would like to broaden your perspective about young women going to higher education. If I look at, my research has been with women who had disabilities, for example, but looking at the family and at intergenerational perspective has really opened my analysis. Because if you look at, for example, the social welfare state that has been, the Belgian contract has been, social contract has been built by Catholic values and the traditional Catholic family. I think if I look at that social welfare state and then subject positions that belong to what I call the household of emotions, like women, childcare, babies, elderly people, and care for them. I think women is pretty much one of those subject positions, and I see that in our Catholic tradition it was quite difficult to break out of that subject position of becoming a mother and doing your household. And if I look at my research where people challenge that and break out, it has a lot to do with perhaps what Sarah calls, you have a negative feminism, that copies the new models. But then, and that's when I come back to my point of departure with the intergenerational perspective. You have, I strongly believe in looking at feminism that is where women empower each other over generations, and it's like an alternative framework that they keep rolling in their network and in their family, and it's not in most of the times it's not in their. I wrote it down because I like how you said that in the small nuclear family, but an extended family network that is not closing down opportunities but broadening your perspectives. I think it would be lovely to hear more about what you learned in your research. I thought the example that Chia gave about that mother that went to university and then she was very much afraid of her daughter who went to university and be sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And what did he say? I wonder how do you explain that?
And this may have to be the last question because unless I'll just do a round, but couldn't live without. Just because Chia essentially is.
Well, I mean these communities. I mean, they're very closed. They're very protected. Yeah, the way boys and girls are brought up, segregated also. So there's the fear there. In general, yeah, the fear of the way it could be threatening. A young girl could find her a Gentile boyfriend or something like this. So this kind of thing they're very much scared of. In terms of, you know, maybe not so much intergenerational, but in terms of community of women and so on, yes, it is very much strong in these communities. I was saying, you know, families, mothers, grandmothers help out, help each other out. It's very much gender segregated, as I said, but you also have women, you know, taking roles as like volunteers and this kind of thing, helping at schools. So there's definitely no, you know, there's no confinement in that sense, and very much a, you know, big solidarity. I mean, solidarity in the community is enormous. You know, I mean, I think Sarah was also pointing to like babysitters and so on. I mean, this is enormous in the community. They have their own welfare institution, their own welfare. Okay? I mean, if someone who's if you have children, you might borrow things like prams and so on. You know, if families that have children, and there's lots of voluntary work. Also among richer families, young girls will go to, you know, babysit at more poorer families, so the parents can, you know, get out or whatsoever. So there's very much solidarity in that sense. Intergenerational, yes, but protection in the context, you know, against what's perceived as dangerous and threatening, and on the boys as well. You know, it's not just on the girls; it's definitely on the boys as well.
Yes. Sarah, do you have anything you want to?
No, I think that the project of rebuilding these extended families is central to the family syndicate. Like, it's really, that is the aim. The analysis is that the problem is that it's not there anymore, and the aim is to rebuild it intergenerational. And of course, these extended families are, per definition, intergenerational. So also this thing of giving potential grandparents in the city of Milan who do not have their grandchildren in the city, and children who do not have their grandparents in the city, to link them and give them new grandparents and new grandchildren. I mean, it goes quite far. And I mean, like, on a sustained basis, not only you come and babysit now, but it's really recomposition of like a social tissue. Intergenerational, what I noticed was, because this is not really elaborated in my doctoral research, because I focused on younger women in all of the case studies, so basically religious student activism or on campuses, like, and the younger women, as I reported, it was so difficult to get them any kind of conversation going on about sexual difference, gender, sexuality, family. They did not, it was almost a case of like, it was almost a different category, like they did not identify with that whole, which was put together as woman, family, whatever, somebody who's sexually active, of course that's also connected to that. So they almost perceived themselves in a different category altogether. So that was, I think, the generational gap between the fact that all my younger respondents, I could not have decent conversations about gender and sexuality. Whereas with Alban and a number of older respondents, they had very strong discourses on it. I think it's maybe a different moment in life or something.
And it's also because of, you know, the emphasis on virginity and celibacy. There's different, you know, whereas in the case of Orthodox Judaism, I mean, it's reproduction, and so that's, you know, and the family is essential, and reproduce and stay within the group and so on, and have as many children as possible and so on. So automatically it's a very conservative.
Okay, just a small quick one, because I was intrigued in looking through what you wrote at the category of disability, that sometimes, for example, in Portugal, there is a strong social contract that women, intergenerational, for example, if a woman wants to go to university, she can have children, and then grandparents who say, I will take care for your children. If that also means that when I am old and disabled, that you will take care for me. And as soon as that is a part of the culture and the tradition, then you see that women are just like doing all different kinds of things than women who are kept in positions like taking care for children in a small family. And I think that's wonderful now.
It can be empowering.
Yeah.
Okay, I wonder if we can pursue this with a glass of wine in our hands in the lobby. Before it closes down, and I thank the speakers. Thank you for a very thought-provoking session, and we hope to see you again. Join me in thanking our speakers.